You were never meant to hear this. In the summer of 1876, in the heart of Kentucky's bluegrass country, 41 men, women, and children walked into the tobacco fields of the Beaumont Plantation. By dawn the next morning, every single one of them was gone. Vanished. Not a body, not a footprint, not even the echo of a scream. Their cabins were left with meals half-eaten, wages untouched, children's toys still waiting by the beds. And yet, every living soul had been erased from that land, as if swallowed whole by the night. The county records tell you they fled north, that they abandoned their work, chasing wages in the factories of Ohio. But that story was a legal fiction crafted in a single day. Subscribe if you want the truth they tried to bury. Signed off by men whose names still ripple through Kentucky's halls of power. Why did the sheriff close the case after just 3 days? Why were federal requests for help ignored? Why, when the Pinkertons themselves were called in, did they describe what happened not as disappearance, but as erasure? What was it about these 41 people, freedmen, immigrants, widows, children, that threatened the order of things so deeply it was safer to annihilate them than allow them to exist? Understand, this history is not written to preserve truth. It is written to preserve power. Every silence in the archive, every closed investigation, every sealed letter, that silence itself is the evidence. And the deeper we pull, the more you'll see that the Beaumont mystery was never about missing workers. It was about something far older, something that has stalked this country since before its founding. Hidden brotherhoods of men who deal not in law, not in faith, but in control. They understood something you were never taught, that integration, cooperation, and dignity for all people is more dangerous to the ruling class than any rebellion, because unity threatens profit, equality undermines hierarchy. And so in the cover of July darkness, the Beaumont Plantation became a demonstration, a lesson written not in ink but in disappearance. You're not hearing a ghost story. You're hearing about a system, a machine, that feeds on silence, that erases the inconvenient and leaves behind nothing but whispers. And now, I'm pulling you further into it. The disappearance began long before that night in July. It began in whispers, in warnings, in sealed envelopes slipped beneath locked doors. Jeremiah Beaumont, the man who inherited the plantation, was not the caricature of a tyrant most expect when they hear the word planter. He was ambitious, yes, ruthless when needed, but he carried a dangerous vision, an integrated workforce, black and white, freedmen and immigrants, working not in bondage but as paid equals. To his peers, this was blasphemy. Understand, Kentucky was not free land in spirit. Even after the chains of slavery had been struck off in law, Reconstruction had been choked by compromise. The ink of emancipation was still wet, but across the South, secret orders worked to ensure it never truly took root. They moved in darkness, gathering in basements, courthouses, and lodge halls under symbols of brotherhood and patriotism. But their true creed was not liberty, it was control. Jeremiah's plantation was not just a business, it was a threat. Imagine a man proving that former slaves and impoverished whites could thrive together outside the old order. Imagine if others followed his example. What would happen to the monopolies of land, to the political dynasties built on poverty and division? It would all come crashing down. And so, Jeremiah was marked, not because he failed, but because he succeeded. The records, hidden for decades, revealed something chilling. Letters signed only with the emblem of the Kentucky Brotherhood. Words written in cold, deliberate ink: seize your experiment. Dissolve your workforce, or consequences will fall, swift and permanent. These were not idle threats. These were verdicts. When Jeremiah appealed to the governor for protection, the letters vanished. When he tried the federal authorities, his words were buried. No cavalry was coming. No lawman would stand between him and what was planned. Now consider this: why do you think the official records insisted those workers fled north? Because if they had vanished through violence, if they had been erased by force, it would demand justice. It would shine a light where none was allowed. But if they fled, if they abandoned their posts, then the blame was theirs, not the system's. A lie, convenient, polished, and archived, and for nearly 150 years that lie has been passed down as truth. What disappeared that night was not just 41 lives, it was a model of a different future. a possibility that threatened the old powers so deeply they buried it in silence. But the silence doesn't hold forever. Secrets rot in the walls of time, and sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can still hear them breathing. When Jeremiah Beaumont's great-niece, Margaret, inherited the crumbling manor in 1923, she didn't just find broken furniture and waterlogged floors. She found letters hidden behind plaster, journals wedged beneath floorboards, records Jeremiah had concealed like contraband, and what they described was not the story of a man who lost his workers, but of a man who was hunted by forces bigger than himself. The Brotherhood. That was their name, but do not let the word brother fool you. Their fellowship was not built on loyalty, it was built on power, on maintaining the old order at any cost. They were landowners, judges, politicians, merchants. They gathered beneath symbols of patriotism, masking themselves in the language of tradition and honor. But behind the veneer, they were a cartel of control, deciding who would prosper, who would starve, who would vanish. Margaret's discovery peeled back the mask. She found evidence of meetings, monthly gatherings in the basement of County Magistrate Hartwell's house. She found records of payments, transfers of land, property seizures, and she found something darker still, coded ledgers referencing corrections. That was their word, corrections. Each time a farm attempted to hire across racial lines, each time a business threatened the monopoly of the Brotherhood's members, a correction would follow. Sometimes it was a fire, sometimes a murder, and sometimes, as in Beaumont's case, it was an erasure. Understand this. What happened to those 41 wasn't random violence. It was systemic. It was a performance of terror, staged for anyone who thought they might follow Jeremiah's example. The Brotherhood's message was simple. This is what happens when you cross us. This is what happens when you dream of equality. And isn't that the same message whispered through every century? Those who attempt to rise above their station silenced. Those who dare unite across divides, broken. Those who threaten the hidden order, erased. The methods change, the stage changes, but the system endures. Margaret's notes were clear. The disappearance of the workers was not an isolated crime. It was one move in a larger game, a cycle of manipulation and control that stretches back before the Civil War and forward into the institutions we trust today. What vanished in 1876 was not just people, it was a page of history. And when history is rewritten, so too is the present. Think carefully. How does a disappearance of 41 people leave no trace? Not a grave, not a confession, not even a rumor that survives intact. Ordinary violence leaves scars, but institutional violence, the kind sanctioned in shadows, leaves silence. That silence is the fingerprint of power. The Brotherhood understood this. They were not thugs in hoods riding under the cover of night, though they used such men when it served them. No, their power was subtler, cleaner. They sat in the courthouse. They owned the newspapers. They decided which stories reached the public, which investigations ended in 3 days, which lives were remembered, and which were scrubbed out like chalk from a slate. Magistrate Hartwell wasn't simply closing an investigation. He was erasing reality. He was declaring to the people of Bourbon County, nothing happened here. And once it was declared, who could contradict it? Ordinary men had no voice. The papers printed what they were told. The churches prayed for order. And within a single season, 41 souls ceased to exist in the record, as though they had never been born. But here's the darker truth. You're still living under that system, because what happened in Bourbon County wasn't about one plantation. It was a demonstration of the machinery of control. The Brotherhood wasn't unique. It was one branch of a wider organism. Networks of families, landowners, financiers, men who understood that true power is not taken with swords, but with silence, that the most effective weapon is not murder, but erasure. And when erasure is complete, it breeds obedience. Neighbors learned the lesson: do not cross the invisible line. Do not unite across race or class. Do not threaten the order. For if you do, you will not just be punished, you will be forgotten. Imagine the psychology of that. To be erased not just from life, but from memory. To have your children's names deleted from the record books, your labor erased from the ledgers, your very existence rewritten as abandonment, betrayal, desertion. It is a violence more lasting than bullets. It is the rewriting of identity itself. The Beaumont disappearance was never solved because it was never meant to be solved. It wasn't a mystery. It was a message, and that message still whispers beneath every institution that tells you what is real and what never happened. Now ask yourself, what is the purpose of erasure? It is not chaos. It is not random cruelty. It is programming. Erasure is used to bend the minds of the living, to teach them what not to see, what not to question, what not to believe. The disappearance at Beaumont was a lesson not only for Jeremiah, but for every man, woman, and child in Bourbon County. It told them, do not defy the order, do not cross the lines we have drawn, or you will vanish as if you never existed. This is psychological control at its rawest form. You don't need to chain a man's body if you chain his mind with fear. You don't need to kill him if you convince him that resistance is pointless. That is how empires, plantations, and governments endure, not through strength alone, but through silence, repetition, and the rewriting of memory. Think of it. How many times in your life have you been told a story that explained away injustice? How often has history presented suffering as an accident, corruption as incompetence, disappearance as coincidence? This is not new. This is not rare. This is the pattern. The archives are not empty because nothing happened. They are empty because something did, and someone decided you should never know it. The Brotherhood wielded this power expertly. Their message didn't just erase the workers, it rewired the minds of the survivors. Neighbors whispered but never acted. Journalists raised questions but never printed. Lawmen shook their heads and moved on. Generation after generation grew up knowing only the official version. They left, they ran away, they abandoned their duty. And so the victims became traitors in memory. That is the final stage of control, making the world believe the lie was always the truth. This is why Jeremiah's hidden letters mattered, because when Margaret discovered them, she cracked the silence. For the first time in half a century, the erased began to speak again, and with their voices came a revelation: the Brotherhood wasn't only enforcing racial order. It was engineering obedience, conditioning entire communities to fear unity. Now here's the dangerous thought: what if you right now are living under the same system? What if every headline, every official statement, every closed investigation is part of the same design? To erase the inconvenient, to rewire your mind so you accept silence as truth. The disappearance of 41 workers is not a story of the past. It is the blueprint of the present. The Brotherhood was not confined to Bourbon County. That is the lie small towns tell themselves, to believe evil is local, contained, unique. But power does not stay small. It metastasizes. What Margaret uncovered in Jeremiah's letters and ledgers was not the anatomy of a county conspiracy, but the blueprint of something larger, a network of influence stretching across state lines, feeding into banks, courts, even the pulpits of churches. Think carefully. Why did Jeremiah's pleas to the governor vanish? Why were his letters to federal authorities ignored? It wasn't incompetence. It was alignment. The Brotherhood's interests were synchronized with those of higher men, men whose names you still know, carved into courthouses and monuments. Men who understood that controlling land was only the first step. Controlling memory, controlling truth itself, was the next. By the late 19th century, Kentucky was not the only place where integrated labor experiments collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Across Tennessee, Alabama, even into Ohio, records whisper of similar patterns: fires, disappearances, bankruptcies, always hitting those who dared to unite the poor across race. And each time, the local magistrates, the judges, the papers, all told the same story: desertion, accident, misfortune. The same lie, repeated until it hardened into accepted fact. You must see the pattern. These were not isolated tragedies, they were coordinated corrections. And each correction carried a lesson for the living. Do not challenge the hierarchy, do not reach across the divide, do not attempt to rise. And it worked. Entire generations of freedmen and poor whites remained fractured, suspicious of one another, convinced they could never thrive together. The unity Jeremiah had glimpsed, the unity that could have rewritten the South, was strangled before it drew breath. The Brotherhood did not just remove 41 workers, they removed the possibility of a different future. But here is where the descent grows darker, because Margaret's ledgers revealed more than erasure. They revealed transformation. Some of the very men she identified in the 1870s as enforcers of the Brotherhood had, by the 1890s, reinvented themselves as community leaders. They became donors to schools, patrons of churches, architects of public life. Outwardly, they appeared as benefactors. Inwardly, they were the same men who had orchestrated disappearances. That is how true power operates, not only through fear, but through disguise. The very hand that strangles you in the dark is the one offering you charity in daylight. And when you cannot tell enemy from savior, resistance itself collapses. This is how corruption becomes immortal. It learns to wear masks. The Kentucky Brotherhood did not vanish after the Beaumont disappearances. It evolved. By the turn of the century, the same men who silenced Jeremiah's workers were sitting on school boards, funding libraries, endowing scholarships. They were no longer just planters and magistrates. They had become architects of memory. And that is the most dangerous role of all. Think about it. Who decides what your children are taught in school? Who selects which names become heroes in the textbooks and which names dissolve into footnotes, or worse, vanish entirely? Who funds the museums? Who edits the archives? Who prints the official histories? The Brotherhood understood control of memory is control of destiny. And so they rebranded themselves not as conspirators, but as custodians of culture. Margaret's discoveries made this plain. In one ledger, she found coded entries that linked Brotherhood funds to educational societies in Lexington. In another, she saw payments labeled press relations. Money funneled to local editors who, coincidentally, published glowing profiles of Brotherhood men while erasing all mention of their victims. Even the churches played their part, sermons warning of the dangers of radical equality, all financed by discreet donations. The same pulpits that preached forgiveness also sanctified division. This is psychological control at its highest level, not through threats in the night, but through ideas whispered in daylight. If you can convince a man that history unfolded exactly as it was written, if you can convince him that suffering was deserved, that disappearance was desertion, you don't need to chain him. He will chain himself to the lie. And here's the bitter truth. This system never stopped. It only changed its mask again and again. From brotherhoods to parties, from lodges to corporations, from pulpits to podiums, the machinery of erasure has persisted. Look at your own time. How many stories are buried under national security? How many scandals sealed in classified archives? How many disappearances explained away as accidents, mental illness, or economic migration? The phrasing shifts, the excuses modernize, but the template remains. Jeremiah tried to build something that threatened the old order. 41 people paid the price for his vision, and then their erasure was transformed into curriculum, into law, into collective memory. That is how an atrocity becomes not just forgotten, but useful. By the dawn of the 20th century, the seed planted in Bourbon County had grown into something far larger, an invisible architecture shaping the nation itself. What began as a brotherhood of planters and magistrates became the silent backbone of institutions that still claim authority today. The disappearances at Beaumont were not a closed chapter, they were the prologue to a longer story of engineered amnesia. Look closely at the early decades of the 1900s. While America celebrated progress, railroads, factories, electric light, another progress was unfolding in the shadows, the professionalization of forgetting. Universities began publishing official histories of the South, written not to reveal but to conceal. They glorified noble planters, romanticized plantations, and reduced the struggles of freedmen to social instability. And who funded these projects? The very descendants of men like Magistrate Hartwell, now wearing suits instead of robes, seated on boards of trustees. The same pattern emerged in law. Entire doctrines of segregation and separate but equal were justified by selective memory. Judges cited histories that were never true, statistics that were deliberately bent. Erasure had become legislation. What Jeremiah had feared, that unity would be destroyed not just in flesh, but in law, was fulfilled. And yet, the most chilling piece was not legal or academic. It was psychological. Mass media was rising, newspapers, photographs, later radio, and with them, the Brotherhood's blueprint found its most powerful tool: A story broadcast to thousands does not need chains or blood. It only needs to repeat itself until no one questions it. The erasure of Beaumont's 41 workers became a template. Inconvenient truths could be drowned under a flood of louder lies. Think of how effective this is. Once the official story circulates, dissent becomes madness. To suggest otherwise is to mark yourself as unstable, unpatriotic, dangerous. And so the cycle repeats. Victims become deserters, killers become benefactors, and silence becomes the national anthem. Margaret's hidden ledgers showed that by 1910, Brotherhood money was flowing not just into Kentucky institutions, but into Washington lobbies and national presses. The local conspiracy had become federal influence. The disappearance of workers from a tobacco plantation was no longer just a rural secret. It was the foundation stone of a system that could erase inconvenient people anywhere, anytime, on any scale. Now pause. Ask yourself, if 41 men and women could be deleted in 1876 with no trace, how many more have vanished since? Written off as accidents, as vagrants, as nameless statistics. How many stories buried beneath the official narrative are still waiting to be unearthed? Because the machinery that erased Beaumont never stopped turning, it only became more refined. The story of Beaumont is not just history, it is prophecy. What the Brotherhood perfected in 1876 has become the operating system of modern power. Erasure is no longer performed in barns or swamps. It is executed in offices, courtrooms, and digital servers. The same logic applies. Remove the inconvenient, rewrite the record, flood the silence with an official explanation. Think about the headlines you scroll past every day. Worker disappears after whistleblowing. Journalist vanishes abroad. Files destroyed in mysterious fire. You are told these events are isolated, unfortunate, unconnected. But the blueprint says otherwise. The pattern remains the same. Silence the voice, erase the trace, replace it with a palatable lie. Technology has only made this easier. In Jeremiah's time, the Brotherhood needed torches, bribes, and threats. Today, a keystroke can erase data, a press release can overwrite truth, a trending headline can bury a scandal beneath 1,000 distractions. And when the public finally looks up, the narrative is already settled, stamped into memory as fact. This is not conspiracy theory. It is historical continuity. The erasure of 41 workers was a lesson in obedience. Now that lesson has been scaled to entire populations. Wars vanish into euphemisms like operations. Civilian deaths are counted as collateral damage. Entire communities displaced by industry are described as voluntary resettlements. Language itself has become the eraser. Margaret's warning in her journals was chillingly clear. The Brotherhood does not only destroy lives, it destroys the ability to remember they ever existed. She feared a future in which erasure would become so seamless, so ordinary, that generations would never even question it. That future is here. So I ask you, when you read history, when you accept the story handed to you by those in power, how much of it is real? How much has been carefully rewritten, repackaged, sterilized for your consumption? And worse, what has been completely deleted? Because if Beaumont taught us anything, it is this: the most dangerous crime is not killing the body, it is killing the truth. Night fell heavy on the Beaumont plantation the evening the workers vanished. The August air was thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat, the field still radiating the day's heat. Lanterns flickered in the cabins, voices low, tired, unaware that they were living their final hours of freedom. The records say nothing. The newspapers mention only desertion. But Margaret's fragments, those half-burned ledgers, paint a different picture, one of precision. She noted purchases of rope, of kerosene, of shovels made in bulk. These were not supplies for farming. These were tools for disappearance. Imagine it, the creak of wagon wheels at midnight, approaching from the tree line. Men cloaked not in uniforms but in silence, their faces covered, their oaths sworn, dogs muzzled to keep them quiet, the cabins broken open, the workers pulled from their beds. No time to scream, no time to fight, only the sudden understanding that this was not an accident, not a warning. It was final. Some were bound and loaded onto wagons. Others, Margaret suggests, were marched at gunpoint into the dark fields. Children cried, mothers begged, and still the procession moved like a funeral in reverse. 41 souls dragged away not to be mourned, but to be erased. And then, the flames. The cabins were torched, their meager belongings turned to ash. A community burned from the record, as if it had never existed. The smoke rising into the Kentucky night carried no cries, no witnesses, only the silent satisfaction of men who believed they were securing history itself. By dawn, the fields were empty. The earth where the wagons had rolled showed no sign of struggle. The cabins smoldered, reduced to black skeletons of wood. And in town, the magistrates were already preparing the official statement. The workers deserted. Jeremiah Beaumont is ruined. Order has been restored. That is how erasure feels. Not like chaos, but like choreography. Not like a crime, but like a ritual. 41 human beings vanished into the earth, and the world above carried on as though nothing had happened. And that is why their silence still screams. Because once you hear it, once you glimpse even a fragment of their final night, you understand this was not about punishing workers. This was about destroying possibility itself. The silence of that night in 1876 never truly ended. It only changed its form. What began with wagons and torches has returned in newer disguises. Disappearances no longer require ropes and flames. They can happen with paperwork, with algorithms, with silence in a courtroom. The choreography remains, only the instruments differ. Think about it. How many times have you read a brief article about a missing journalist, an activist who vanished crossing a border, a community relocated for development? The language is always sterile, lost contact, unconfirmed whereabouts, voluntary departure. Each phrase is a polished coffin for truth, lowered into the ground without a sound. This is the legacy of Beaumont. The Brotherhood didn't just erase people, they engineered a method, a ritual vanishing that has survived into our own age. Back then, fire consumed cabins. Now, digital fire consumes hard drives, servers, and evidence. Then, wagons carried the missing into forests. Now, drones erase witnesses in deserts or mountains. Different century, same silence. Margaret feared this future more than anything. In one of her final notes, she wrote, "The erasure will not end here. It will evolve until entire nations forget their wounds, until children inherit a history written entirely by the guilty." And looking around today, isn't that exactly what we see? Textbooks smoothing over atrocities, archives lost to flooding or fire. Families told their disappeared loved ones simply moved on. The workers of Beaumont were the prototype, 41 erased, their story replaced with a lie. And every modern disappearance, whether in Kentucky, in Mexico, in Syria, or on your own city streets, carries their echo, because here is the truth. History is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what was allowed to be remembered. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what has been erased from your lifetime that you will never know? Now pause for a moment. Step back from the story and ask yourself, if 41 men and women could be erased in 1876 without a trace, what stops the same thing from happening to you today? Your memories, your photos, your digital footprint, all of it exists on fragile ground. A hard drive wiped, a server crash, an error in the archives, a headline reframed just enough to twist truth into fiction. How long before your life could be rewritten in the same way Beaumont's workers were? Think about how dependent we've become on official records to define what is real. Your birth certificate, your medical files, your employment history, your bank account. Each one is a piece of paper, a database entry, something controlled not by you, but by institutions. If those entries vanish, who are you in the eyes of history? Who would believe your story if the evidence was gone? This is not paranoia, it is power. The same ritual that silenced 41 in Kentucky now operates quietly, invisibly in the systems we trust every day. Disappearances need no torches when silence can be coded into law, into media, into memory itself. Margaret's journals warned of this exact danger. She wrote, "There will come a time when a man may stand alive before you, and still, history will declare him dead. And there will come a time when the dead may be erased so completely that even grief is stolen from the living." That is the true horror of erasure. It doesn't only take lives, it takes away the right to mourn them, the ability to even remember they were ever here. So, ask yourself, if the Brotherhood's blueprint still lingers, shaping the way truth is controlled, how certain are you that your history, your family, your future, hasn't already been edited? Because the most terrifying disappearances are not the ones we see. They are the ones we never notice. Surveillance, archives, digital control. These are not neutral tools. They are the modern wagons, the new torches of erasure. And if you think they exist to preserve your history, you've already accepted the lie. Every camera that watches you, every record stored in a database, every keystroke logged, these are chains disguised as protection. You're told it's about safety, about order, about convenience. But Margaret's warnings echo. The Brotherhood cloaks itself in necessity. The erasure is never called by its true name. Consider this: in Beaumont's time, the Brotherhood only had to bribe a sheriff, burn some cabins, and write a headline. Today, it's simpler. A corrupted archive can vanish decades of evidence with a single command. A glitch in a system can accidentally delete birth records or criminal files. A national database can quietly mark a person non-existent, and suddenly, no job, no travel, no vote. You don't need to be locked in a cell if the world refuses to acknowledge you exist. And history, it has always been written by the survivors, but now it is curated by servers, controlled by a handful of corporations, governments, and gatekeepers who decide what is remembered, what is buried, and what is rewritten. The Brotherhood doesn't need to stand in the shadows anymore. Their blueprint has been absorbed into the system itself. Do you see it? What happened in Kentucky was not an isolated horror. It was a rehearsal for a century of controlled memory. And if you believe your life is too small, too unimportant to be noticed, remember, so were the 41. Farmers, laborers, families, ordinary people who vanished because their existence threatened the wrong man's story. So I'll ask again, if the system decided tomorrow that you should be erased, digitally, historically, personally, who would remember you? Who would fight to prove you were ever here? Because the Beaumont legacy isn't about the past. It's about the machinery of forgetting, and it is humming louder than ever. Margaret's final days read like the unraveling of a mind that knew too much. The journals grow frantic, her handwriting jagged, ink splattered as though she wrote with trembling hands. By then, she had stopped recording births, deaths, harvests. Instead, her pages became warnings, letters not meant for her time, but for ours. She wrote of shadows following her carriage at dusk, of men she recognized from the night of the disappearance, now watching her window from the tree line. She wrote of strange knocks on her door, of her belongings being moved when she returned home, of whispers in the courthouse corridors. The widow Beaumont is remembering too much. But the most disturbing entries were not about the threats. They were about her obsession with preservation. She began burying copies of her notes in iron boxes, hiding them in the soil beneath oak roots, behind stones near the riverbank. Each one sealed with wax, each one inscribed with a single phrase, "For those who come after." Imagine her, in the dead of night, lantern dimmed, clawing at the earth with blistered hands, desperate to keep some fragment of truth alive, not for herself, but for someone, anyone, in a future she would never see. The townspeople called her mad. They said the loss of her husband had broken her. They said the widow was haunted, chasing ghosts that never existed. But perhaps that was the Brotherhood's greatest triumph, convincing the world she was delusional, so her warnings would be dismissed. And then, silence. One day Margaret's journal simply ends. No closing, no signature, just a half-finished sentence. They are not finished, they. The rest of the page is blank. Some say she fled. Others claim she was taken. But her final fragments suggest something far more chilling, that she knew her words were not meant to save her, but to save us. That her life's last purpose was to plant seeds of memory before the Brotherhood buried her too. And the question that lingers is this: if Margaret risked everything to preserve even a whisper of truth, what does that mean about what we've already lost? Margaret's buried fragments were never meant for her neighbors, nor for the town that mocked her. They were meant for us. She seemed to know, somehow, that the Brotherhood's design would outlive her century, that its silence would seep into every generation. And so she left her warnings like seeds, waiting for the day someone would dig them up and recognize them for what they were, proof that erasure was not an accident, but a craft. Think about it. We scroll past headlines every day. A name, a face, a missing person, gone from the feed within hours, replaced by the next distraction. We forget. And in that forgetting, the Brotherhood's work is complete. Margaret's words burn like prophecy against this backdrop. The forgetting is their victory. What she feared most was not the violence itself, but the indifference that followed, the way the world moves on as though the missing never mattered. And isn't that exactly how it feels today? We've been trained to witness erasure as routine, to accept absence as normal. But Margaret did not believe silence was inevitable. Her fragments suggest that memory itself is resistance, that even one person refusing to forget could fracture the Brotherhood's spell. That's why she wrote, why she buried her words in the soil, because she believed that someday someone would remember. And that someone is you. You sitting here hearing this story, you realizing that the erasure of Beaumont is not a ghost tale from Kentucky's past, but a mirror held up to your present. You were never meant to hear this. That's why the journals are so rare, why the story was never told in school, why the 41 were replaced with silence. Because if you remember them, if you refuse to let them vanish, then the Brotherhood loses. That is Margaret's final legacy. She did not die trying to save herself. She died trying to save memory. And now the question falls to you, will you let her sacrifice be forgotten, or will you carry it forward? So here we stand, at the edge of Margaret's silence, staring into the hollow where 41 lives should have been. Their voices cut away, their faces scrubbed from record, their graves unmarked. And yet, you know them now. You have heard their story, which means the erasure has failed, if only for this moment. But memory is fragile. It survives only if you carry it forward. That is the trap Margaret foresaw. Forgetting is effortless. Remembering is a choice. The Brotherhood counted on your silence, on your willingness to move on. So ask yourself, what if the very act of remembering, of refusing to look away, is the only rebellion left? Because when you whisper their names, when you hold their absence in your mind, you are undoing the Brotherhood's work. You are giving the 41 what history denied them existence. Margaret's words linger like a command. The lost are never gone, so long as one remains to speak of them. And now that one is you. And when the lights go out tonight, when the quiet settles and you're left alone with your thoughts, remember this: the Beaumont legacy is not a story about the past. It is a story about you, about how easily your life, your family, your truth could be erased, and about how thin the line truly is between being remembered and being forgotten forever. You were never meant to hear this, but now that you have, what will you do with it?